Welcome to Turning the Page. I'm host Donnie Morse, and today we have with us a very, very special guest, William Hartley, Bill Hartley of BYU, who has written a number of books, 13 books if I'm not mistaken, and a number of articles. We're pleased to have him with us here today. Bill, welcome to the program.
Thank you for letting me be here.
You bet. We wanted to start first by talking about some of your other books that you have published or written. First, obviously not your first book, but you have My Best for the Kingdom, which was the autobiography of John Low Butler, who was the first bishop here in Spanish Fork, and early church member who served in Nauvoo and Missouri and came to Utah and basically helped settle Spanish Fork.
Right.
Great book, won a number of awards, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
How did you enjoy writing that book?
Well, history writing is fun. It's been great that I've been paid to write history.
Oh.
It would be a hobby if I weren't employed doing it. The past is a foreign country, and when you start probing into a subject, it's kind of a combination of detective work, mystery solving, solving puzzles, listening to gossip. It's a great emotional experience to be on the adventure of figuring out something in history.
You mean some of these important people like John Low Butler, they didn't keep these immaculate journals and tell us their exact feelings? And
well, in the case of John Butler, he died at an early age, before he was 60, but he died, just before he died, he wrote his life story. And so we have about a 58-page history of Butler. And so we use that as the basis, as the core, and then we wrapped around it, you know, the information from government sources and church sources and diaries and journals and newspapers and all that.
So there's a lot of good Spanish Fork history in that first, My Best for the Kingdom.
Yes, he dies in Spanish Fork in 1861, is buried in the cemetery up here.
Oh, our first mayor, first bishop.
He was not a mayor. Butler was not a mayor, but he was a bishop for about 6 years. And that was through an interesting period in Utah history and in church history. The 1850s is rich from you know, the settlement period on through the famine of 1856, through the Utah War, and the occupation by the Army not far from here. Fascinating story. Yeah, fascinating.
And with that, then, a new book that has just come out as well is Golden Treasure, which is a history of John Low Butler II.
Right.
Which is, again, starts here in Spanish Fork, but he ends up settling other parts of Utah.
That's correct. That's not my book. That's a follow-up to my book by the family.
Yes. And then some of the other titles that you've done is My Fellow Servants, which is essays on the history of the priesthood. Wow. I mean, we all know the story of John the Baptist coming and visiting Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery. But
one of my first assignments as I was hired by the church historian in 1972, and we had a number of projects assigned us by the first presidency. But one of the first projects I was assigned to was to look at the historical development of the priesthood, not at the general authority level, the presidents of the church, quorum of the 12, but at the grassroots level. So my take on Utah history, on church history, has always been the common people level of things. And so the priesthood studies had to do with, well, what was it like to be an active member of the church in 1870, let's say? What was a deacon's quorum in Nauvoo? You know, what were the 70s doing in the pioneer period? So a lot of those studies deal with that. One of Brigham Young's major achievements that hardly anybody knew about was just before he died, he totally restructured the church in Utah from stem to stern. Every stake, every ward, every quorum was restructured. And it was a major administrative move on his part that affected greatly the local operations of the church.
Well, that brings us to your most recent book, Another Kind of Gold, which is the life of Albert King Thurber. William, tell us a little bit, who is this Albert King Thurber and why should we care?
Albert King Thurber was a young man in Rhode Island, and he worked in a comb factory. And about the time he's in his early 20s, news arrives from California that gold was discovered. Young men in the East Coast became absolutely excited. This was our chance to become somebody, to get money, to impress the women, the girls at home. So Albert joins a company of 50 young men from Boston that head for the gold fields. They have uniforms, they have it's money that they invest. And this company of 50 reaches what is Kansas City today and fights with each other and divides into two companies. Should we go with a mule team or should we go with ox team? And they finally, Thurber, speeding the story up, arrives in Salt Lake City with 4 other men and a mule pack team heading for California. They camp in downtown Salt Lake near the Jordan River, and Thurber walks into town and asks somebody, "What are you Mormons? What do you believe?" And when somebody talks to him about it, having had some religious background himself in New England, he's fascinated and drops out, lets his men go on to California, and he stays and joins the LDS Church.
And that's what the title comes from, another kind of gold.
Yes.
He comes to the West looking for yellow gold.
Right.
Instead finds a different kind of gold.
Finds kind of an eternal or rich, religious gold.
So he's here in Utah and basically joins the church. We won't go into his conversion that much, but you need to pick up the book to read that, to find out about his conversion. But what happens to him?
Well, he starts working in the Mill Creek area of Salt Lake, and the church quietly wants to have a team of gold mining missionaries in California to try to bring gold into Utah to help the struggling economy out. So Thurber is picked to be one of those 20. So he actually does go to California after all. And he keeps one of the best journal accounts of 49ers going to California and being in California. His journal's been reproduced in a number of books on the gold rush. And so he will go on the southern route, which there is no road at that point, no wagon road to speak of. The first wagons really go in late 1849, and he's in one of those. They struggle across southern Utah and across to Vegas Springs, as it was called, and across Cajon Pass. And they finally reach San Bernardino and the California coast, and then they take a steamer up to San Francisco and go into the gold fields. Huh. They work like crazy, and they get very little gold. And Thurber will come home that fall across that long route along the Humboldt River up north of Great Salt Lake and arrive in Salt Lake City basically destitute.
So he comes back, if I remember right, $4.50 in his pocket is what he says he has, a couple pairs of pants and 1 mule.
That's right.
And
well, technically he had 2 mules, because one of the mules belonged to John W. Berry, who's one of his colleagues in the gold fields. And Berry says, "Would you please deliver that mule to my mother?" Ah. So he comes down to the Mill Creek area and finds Mrs. Berry, but he also finds a sister of John Berry's named Thurza, and he and Thurza will get married, and then will become settlers early on in Spanish Fork.
Now, if I remember right, she was quite young. We're going to have to read the book to find out how young, but it was very common at that time for young women to get married early.
Yes, yeah. In that period of time, we don't have teenagers, the concept of teenagers, a timeout period of high school and music and dress and all this stuff, until in the 20th century. In the 19th century, especially in the agrarian areas, you were a child until you could do adult work, and then you just went into adult level of things. And so bigger boys at age 12 would do men's work, and older girls, would become women. Set up their own households as soon as they could. There's no other options, basically. Work in your own house, your family, or get in your own setup.
So shortly after they get married, they move to the then Palmyra area, right here in Spanish Fork.
They moved down to a barely started out settlement along the Spanish Fork River. There's a little settlement at the lower end of the river called Palmyra. It's not on good ground, and in time they will give that up and move farther up the river. There will be 2 settlements to start with, one at Palmyra. They call it the lower settlement and the upper settlement. And then during the Walker War, the lower settlement will try to join the fording up that takes place upriver in what is today right here Spanish Fork. And so they're part of this hardscrabble group that has to scratch the land into farms, put in roads, put in fences, and they try to deal in a good way with the Native Americans who love this area. And there will be set up early, once Utah becomes a territory, and the federal government has responsibility for Native Americans in the territory. Brigham Young will be the Indian agent in charge, but they will set up a Spanish Fork Indian farm, which is basically from up close to up here down to the lake itself. And the Indian farm will have several hundred Indians on it that the government is trying to teach how to farm.
Really?
And so the Spanish Fork settlers will be deeply involved in helping make that farm happen. And both John Butler, that I wrote about earlier, and Albert King Thurber especially, will become involved in that, and Thurber will learn the native languages. And he will become even though he becomes an officer in the Nauvoo Legion, in time he'll be a brigadier general in the Nauvoo Legion. But he's always part of the Legion here in Spanish Fork, but he's very sensitive to the Native Americans. And he becomes a good friend of theirs, and in time Brigham Young will move him from Spanish Fork down to Sevier County to pacify and to kind of teach the Native Americans how to farm. And at his funeral, when he dies in 1888 in Richfield, many, many Native Americans attended the funeral and wept when they lost their good friend.
Really? Well, let's take a commercial break, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about the relationship Albert had with John Lowe Butler.
Okay.
We'll be right back. This is Turning the Page.